what you will, counsel.
Well,
I was explaining exactly what the situation was in Central America and how it would affect the national security of the United States of America.
This is an NBC News special report. Congressional inquiry. The Iran-Contra connection. Here is Tom Brokaw in New York.
Good afternoon, everyone. Well, this is the fourth quarter of the appearance before the Iran Congressional Committee that has been investigating all the various aspects of the Iran-Contra scandal this afternoon. We're now back inside with our television cameras. This is the Senate caucus room, which was the site, of course, of the famous Watergate hearings. It's been switching back and forth between the House side and the Senate side. Senate presiding now. Members are upset in part, the congressional members of this committee, is that they've been sitting as really decoration here for 4 days, not able to ask questions. Occasionally they have raised a point of order, both on the Republican and Democratic side, and the hired guns, John Niels, George Van Cleve, and Arthur Liman, have had all of the limelight so far. And that young man that you see before you, 43-year-old Oliver North, Lieutenant Colonel, U.S. Marine Corps, whatever else you think of his philosophy, has become a kind of instant national folk hero in the eyes of a lot of people. That is his wife, Betsy, with him. She began to appear yesterday when he read his opening statement, which had been delayed by rules. Now we would expect, I would think, a very dramatic closing session of questioning by Arthur Liman, the very highly regarded New York trial lawyer who has been described by some as the master litigator or courtroom performer of his generation of lawyers. Although Brendan Sullivan, who represents Oliver North, sitting just to his left, has his own very considerable set of admirers as well. That's Betsy North. They have 4 children. He describes her as his best friend. And he described how when he became the target of an assassination attempt by Abu Nidal, he was mostly concerned about his family being exposed to that risk. He was willing to meet Nidal on even terms, as he described it, anywhere in the world. Arthur Liman, now in place. 54-year-old Harvard and Yale Law School graduate, Harvard undergraduate degree. Good academic credentials here. Oliver North, graduate of the Naval Academy. Brendan Sullivan is lawyer from Georgetown Law. Arthur Liman from Harvard and Yale Law. Daniel Inouye has gabbled this afternoon session to order.
The hearing will please come to order. Mr. Liman, proceed, sir.
Colonel, did there come a time when the pricing of the arms to Iran, which were yielding the profits, began to cause a problem?
I'm not quite certain, counsel, whether it was the pricing or simply the person we were arranging it through, but there was some difficulty with that, yes.
In fact, did there come a time when you were advised that Mr. Ghorbanifar was saying that the Iranian government had concluded that it had been substantially overcharged?
Yes, that's correct.
And he reported that the Iranian government had gotten hold of some microfiche of Defense Department prices?
In fact, to be more explicit, the Iranian government was apparently still on the mailing list for those microfiches.
And he said that looking at those microfiches and what Ghorbanifar had charged them, there was a 600% markup or something like that.
I'm not sure of the percentage that he alluded to, but he did indicate that they had been overcharged.
And when you first got deeply involved in December and January, one of the problems you had encountered then was that the Iranians were claiming that they had been cheated by Nimrati et al., right?
The cheating in that case was the delivery of a system that did not fulfill their expectations and what they had been told that it would do.
And now,
it was not, as I understood it, an issue of price, but more of capability.
and now you were faced with accusations from the first channel that they were being cheated by our pricing, right?
That was what he told us, but it turns out that it was not so much an internal Iranian problem, I don't think, so much as it was his personal problem.
Now, did you have a conversation with Director Casey about the fact that the Iranians had failed to pay the financiers of the transaction?
We had several, but the one that is, of course, most easily recollected is the one that I had with Director Casey after Mr. Furmark had approached him.
And did you consider, with various of your colleagues in the government, ways of dealing with the problem that you now had?
Yes, along with discussions with the Israelis as to how to deal with that problem.
Right. Now, was one of the things that you considered increasing the charges to the second channel so as to generate money to pay the first channel?
That was considered.
And indeed, are you aware it's reflected in your notes?
I couldn't guess at this point, Counsel.
Well, it's Exhibit 353, and it's bears our Bates stamp Q2559. And if you look at the top,
The highlighted...
yes, the highlighted portions, there's some portions there which I think you can appreciate we should not read because it refers to the second channel.
Right.
Best way to recoup funds to pay off Furmark at all is to overcharge on subsequent deliveries. And then the next highlighted, next shipment will have to be higher, $10,000 each. And then it says, or we cannot, and then I don't think the word is finished.
I believe that is a discussion with Mr. Neer. Those are notes taken, I think, if I don't have the preceding and succeeding pages, but looking at what does follow and what is on, is the page behind that, Counsel 353, the preceding page?
It's the preceding one, and it appears to be a conversation with Mr. Neer, was the only name that appears.
Yes, in looking at this, I recollect that this is most likely one of many conversations I had with Mr. Neer about this problem. I would also point out that throughout this entire endeavor, Mr. Neer insisted that we keep the prices up. Whether, as we assumed, that was because the Israelis did not want us underbidding what they were normally doing, or whether that was simply to generate more revenues for their other operations, I do not know.
Well, in any event, did you discuss with Mr. Casey that you had to find some way of dealing with the claims of the first channel and their financiers? Is that fair to say?
Yes, although I must tell you that there were many who advocated, not many, but some who, there weren't many who knew about this, but within the group of people who knew about it, there were some of us who advocated letting Mr. Ghorbanifar deal with it himself. It was a problem that he had created. I would point out that although we had certainly run the charges up, Mr. Ghorbanifar had almost doubled it on top of that. And so many of the problems that were created were of his own design.
Is it a fact that the problem that you were concerned about was his threat or the threat of his financiers to make this public?
Well, yes, absolutely.
And so an operation that had been kept quiet from Congress was now in danger of being blown by people who said they hadn't been paid.
Well, again, I don't want to leave anyone with a misapprehension that it was simply a matter of keeping it secret from Congress. As I have testified for nearly 4 days, this was an operation that was to be kept secret across the board. And it wasn't simply a matter of keeping it from the Congress.
When you say...
It was a covert operation for all of the reasons that I have described the needs for secrecy and covert operation.
Well, when you say secret across the board, would you agree with me that at the very least the following people knew about our involvement? One, Mr. Gabanifar.
Certainly, he started it.
The Israelis.
Some in the Israeli government.
The Iranian government officials in the first channel.
Yes.
The Iranian government officials in the second channel.
That's correct.
So that you were willing, now when I say you, I'm not talking just about you, obviously.
Those engaged in the activity, I understand.
Yes, those who were engaged in the activity were willing to take the risk on trusting them with secrecy, but concluded that it was not possible or prudent to reveal it to the leadership of Congress. That's what it comes down to?
Counsel, you're asking me to second guess the decision not to have advised the Congress in the initiation of this activity on the finding of 6 or 17 January, and I'm not going to second guess that decision. I would point out that in the previous administration, just prior to this one, there was a similar effort to rescue hostages, and to my knowledge, the Congress was not briefed on that one. And there were Iranians and Israelis and foreign government officials and officials throughout our government who were apprised of that activity, and because of the risk to life of American citizens, to include the hostages, the Congress was not briefed.
Was the leadership briefed?
I don't know. I was told that it was not, that I was not here.
Colonel, on this operation, was there any discussion that took place that you are privy to between the beginning of January and the time that this first appeared in that Lebanese newspaper about whether the time had come to tell the intelligence committees?
I was not privy to any conversation to that end, Counsel.
Now, you were involved in providing the bank account number to Elliot Abrams for the Brunei solicitation, right?
I was.
And the fact that the number was transposed was just an error that you never noticed.
Had I noticed it, it wouldn't have been transposed.
Now,
again, Counsel, I have not seen that card. I would point out that my secretary, and as I indicated yesterday, I believe, was not only given the gift of beauty by the good Lord, but she had brains. And I think that the committee had the chance to see that. She made very few errors. And I don't know that she made the error on that card or someone else did. Or that was precisely the card that was carried to give to the representatives of the Brunei government. I would not have given intentionally a wrong number to Mr. Abrams, you can be sure.
Now, did you ask Mr. Abrams not to tell the CIA about the bank account
No, as I
number that you gave him?
recall, he asked me not to tell the CIA.
So that there was a request and an agreement that the CIA wouldn't be told about that?
Yes.
Did you understand that the money from Brunei had been solicited for humanitarian purposes pursuant to the authorization of Congress?
I quite honestly don't think I focused on that. I knew that there was an authorization for the State Department to proceed and solicit monies from other governments. And I honestly don't know that it was specifically for one purpose or another. I don't recall knowing at the time or focusing on the time that it was for one specific purpose or another. What I did assure Mr. Abrams is that those monies would indeed be set aside for whatever purposes he deemed appropriate.
Did he tell you what purposes he deemed appropriate?
I deemed that the purpose was to support the Nicaraguan democratic resistance.
And that would have included, if they needed it, lethal support, not just
well,
rations.
Again, I was fully willing to live within whatever constraints he wished to impose upon that account.
Did he impose any constraints?
Well, we never got any money.
Well, but you thought you were getting money when you gave him the number.
True, and we looked for it assiduously up until the day I was, literally the day I was leaving the NSC.
Colonel, did he, when he asked you for the account, say anything to you about the fact that this is supposed to be used for the purpose for which it was solicited, humanitarian aid?
He may well have, counsel. I guess my problem is I think folks may be trying to make things appear more sinister than they already were, if they were indeed at all. And the point I'm trying to make is that if Mr. Abrams asked me to do that, I would have done it. And I'm not saying he did, and I'm not saying he didn't. Those monies were to be allocated for the purposes that the Department of State solicited them for. That was never an intention on my part to allocate them to some other purpose.
Well, are you saying that those funds, as opposed to the other money in the Lake account, would be dispersed at the direction of Mr. Abrams?
Precisely.
Now, did you give instructions to Mr. Hakim or the General Secord that of the 10 million, 7 million was to be set aside and 3 million was to be available for other purposes?
I do not recall those instructions, but it was not infrequent that we would hope to have some operating revenue, for example, to support airlift, which certainly some can argue was a lethal activity, and yet we funded airlift out of the 27 million in humanitarian assistance. And I do believe that I talked to Mr. Abrams about the need for additional aircraft and continued support for the airlift operations in Central America.
Did the airlift include the drops of lethal supplies behind enemy lines?
It is my distinct recollection, counsel, that we came to the committees to use a portion of the $27 million appropriated by the Congress under what came to be called the Nicaraguan Humanitarian Assistance Office for the purpose of, 1, communications equipment, number 2, mixed loads. Mixed loads meant you took beans and Band-Aids and boots and bullets. And we got authorization to do that from the Congress.
Now, did you, in connection with this money, do you have any recollection of giving instructions on allocation?
Not specifically, no.
And did you
I'm not saying that I didn't.
Did you participate in the briefing of the congressional committees on this subject?
On the Nicaraguan Humanitarian Assistance Office?
Yes.
Yes, I believe I did.
And when you briefed them, did you tell them, is this what you're saying, that you told them that some of the $27 million was going to be used to carry bullets?
No, as I recall, and I may be recalling incorrectly, we came back to the Congress after the appropriations of the $27 million and sought and obtained permission to provide intelligence and communication support and to deliver mixed loads. I may be imagining that, and I've been accused of having fantasies, but that's a fairly distinct recollection on my part.
Well, in fact, you know that the law was changed to permit intelligence information and military and advice You recall that?
Well, and subsequently it was changed to provide $100 million in
Yeah, but even before
full
that.
assistance. That's correct, and that's what I am referring to, counsel.
Yeah. On the Brunei money, was there ever any discussion that some of that money was going to be used to repay the financiers of the first channel?
Never.
That was never contemplated?
It was never a contemplation in my mind.
And never
I never heard it mentioned to me, and I didn't mention it to anyone else.
And never discussed?
Never, sir.
Now, were you involved in the decision to seek the second channel?
Yes.
And you got approval on that from Admiral Poindexter?
I did.
And you were involved in the various negotiations with that channel?
I'm not sure how many there were before I got involved, but the initial contact was made, I think, by General Secord in a European country. He evaluated it, reported back, and if my recollection serves me right, we then had a meeting here in the United States.
And you understood that Mr. Hakim was the person who helped locate that channel?
Yes.
And did Hakim tell you that a $2 million reserve had been set aside in order to make payoffs for the second channel?
Well, as we discussed last night, and I think even during the day yesterday, Mr. Hakim made it clear that there was a necessity to compensate those engaged in the activity. I did not press the issue. I know well the meaning of the term bakshish, and I know it is a long-established tradition in that part of the world. I do not recall discussing a specific amount, but it was very clear to me that that was part of the activity.
Now, was Mr. Hakim presented to the Iranians as the president's personal interpreter?
Not for the second channel. He was for the first.
For the first channel?
That's correct.
Were there some people in the second channel who were also present at meetings with the first channel?
Well, I was.
No, I mean on the Iranian side.
Initially, I don't believe so, but then eventually, as we established contact directly with government officials, yes.
Was General Secord presented as an official representative of the United States government or as a businessman? How was he presented to the second channel?
I don't recall. I know that in the first channel, I may be mixing them up now, he had an alias identity, and I don't recall his specific title within that, but he did have an alias identity, and we had, as you know, alias documentation.
When you were present at the negotiations, who headed the American negotiating team?
Are we talking first or second channel?
Second.
I guess I did.
Now, did you present to the second channel the so-called 7-point plan?
I guess if that's what you're calling it, I suppose I wrote down 7 or 6 or 8 or whatever number of points on a piece of paper. I didn't refer to it at the time, I don't think, as the 7-point plan.
Can you look at Exhibit 308? Where was it presented in, this was done in Europe?
Second channel.
Names. Yeah, this is names.
Well, it's clear that Arthur Liman is not going to finish in 1 hour, as he suggested. They had a delay at the beginning, of course, of the 2 o'clock session because there was some political skirmishing going on.
Is that your writing on the...
Republicans suggesting that Arthur Liman had gone on too long, from the House side at least. Bill Cohen, Republican senator from Maine, saying he did not think that that was the case. And then Henry Hyde, a Republican congressman from
proposal that you presented
Illinois.
to the
also said that he did
second
not think it had gone on too long, and so here we are now in the questioning about who knew and how much.
I'm sure it was. I don't recall whether this was done at the meeting in Washington or the meeting in Europe, but I'm sure that that is one of many proposals, all of which I had tape recorded by the Central Intelligence Agency or by myself with Central Intelligence Agency equipment, so that there would never, ever be any doubt as to what I was saying or obligating or committing to.
Now, Colonel, before you made your proposals to them, did you get authority from anyone as to what you would, as you just said, commit to or present to them?
In general terms, yes. And as you can see, one of them were all American hostages released right up at the top.
Do you recall having a discussion on this subject in Germany?
As I said, I thought maybe this is what I presented in either one of the meetings in the United States, in Germany, in Geneva, Paris,
I think this
any
has
of the
been
other places that we
this
met.
has been identified and was produced by Mr. Hakim as being presented in Germany.
Was there a date on this? And I could check my
There
travel
wasn't.
schedule, but I...
There wasn't. You may have a
Well,
different
I don't
recollection.
think that the location is all that important. But
Now, did you have any conversations with State Department representatives before you made the various proposals that you were making during these negotiations?
no.
Now, you've already testified that in these negotiations, it was necessary for you to make representations that weren't accurate,
No, they're blatantly false.
among other things that you would describe as blatantly false were the statements that the head of state of Iraq had to go, that the President of the United States regarded him in an unfavorable way,
and others.
including an expletive.
Lots of others. All on tape.
And did you discuss with your superiors, in particular Mr. Casey or Admiral Poindexter, before you went into the negotiations, that you would be saying to an official of the Iranian government that the United States supported the removal of the head of state of Iraq, that the United States would give some assistance on the Daiwa prisoners, etc.?
I did not discuss those specifics, no. Many of these are ideas that came up in the course of the earlier parts of the negotiation as seemingly important to those with whom I was dealing, and we were trying to appear responsive. There was no effort whatsoever to deceive anybody in our government from that I was reporting to. I had with me one of Director Casey's finest officers. I had with me CIA communications intelligence support. I had with me CIA personnel who were recording these meetings through surreptitious means. And I made no bones about the fact that these were available to my superiors.
Well,
if anybody had any doubt as to what I was saying, they could have stopped me, and they didn't.
Colonel, I can say for the record that we do have recordings, and they
Thank
do
you.
reflect those statements. Now,
I guess my only question then is, counsel, if you have the tapes, and I think I am the one that pointed
Well,
out
the
the
transcripts, I should
existence
say.
of those tapes and
We have the-
transcripts, I see no reason to have a memory quiz with a man who's been through 5.5 years trying to recall a specific meeting in a certain place.
This isn't a memory quiz. Making a statement about the removal of a head of state, about the United States committing to defend Iran, those are things you remember without looking at the tapes, right?
Yeah, let me just make one observation about the United States committing to defend Iran. That is not the way it was portrayed. The specific statement, reinforced by me after General Secord said it, dealt with the fact that we had built a U.S. Central Command for that specific purpose. And it wasn't something that was a deep, dark secret. The fact is, that's why it exists. That's why the Congress spent literally billions of dollars building that command. It is in every defense journal and foreign affairs journal in the country.
And it was because of that that you felt comfortable in stating that the United States would defend Iran.
The United States would contend that the Soviets should not occupy Iran. And the fact is, whether we had or had not gotten Iranian support, we were not about to relinquish control of Iran to the Soviet Union. And that is why the senators in the back row voted for a U.S. Central Command, and the United States Armed Forces organized one. That is no deep, dark secret, not even to the Iranians.
Colonel, before you made those statements, you've already said you didn't talk to Admiral Poindexter about it.
About that specific point, nor these specific points in the midst of a negotiation that went on over several days, no.
Did you also talk about the fact that there were 2 million homeless people in Iran?
Which also happens to be a fact.
And did you talk about the fact that the United States would supply aid, like a Marshall Plan, for them?
I talked about the fact that they ought to get beyond the issue of trading a few weapons for a few live bodies, and that what our initiative was all about was a reopening with Iran, and that the President of the United States shared those concerns. The fact that I exaggerated my connection with the President of the United States in order to further this initiative, I have already admitted to. The fact is, we in this country have always expressed concern for those kinds of matters. And the fact is, if we could have gotten beyond where we were and established a relationship with Iran, I am confident that we would be doing something for the millions of homeless in Iran and the hundreds of partial paraplegics and those who need prosthetic limbs on both sides of that war.
Did you say words to that effect that you've just expressed with this conviction?
Yes, and they are on the tape.
Now, Colonel, you have talked about the fact that you found yourself very much involved in the management of a covert operation. Did you now find yourself very much involved in a diplomatic assignment?
My whole purpose, as is also on the tape, and is also in the memoranda that I sent forward to my superiors, my whole purpose was to find a way of establishing contact so that a senior U.S. official, and the names of those officials are in the memoranda that I sent to my superiors, could eventually have a meeting with senior Iranian officials, that it would be feasible politically for both sides to be able to do that. And the names of those officials are in the memoranda that I sent forward. The suggestion that the Vice President or the Secretary of State meet with senior Iranians for the purposes of ending that horrible conflict, which happens to be the largest war on the planet Earth right now, would be to the best interests of our country and both of theirs.
Did you have any discussion with Admiral Poindexter as to whether the State Department should be consulted about whether this was the way to achieve the objective that you talked about?
I don't recall that specific discussion, but I think you'll find those general ideas in the terms of reference that were approved for the dialogue in Tehran. And I believe, although I may be incorrect, that those were approved by the State Department.
Is it a fact that the Secretary of State was not told that a mission was going to be going to Tehran?
I have no idea.
Do you recall, and you can look at Exhibit 193, that the question, well, I have them all in 2 books. I don't know how they were broken up in the exhibits you were giving him, but it's 193. Do you recall that you suggested before the Tehran mission to Admiral Poindexter that there be a meeting with Secretary Schultz and Secretary Weinberger, and that he rejected that?
I recall suggesting those kinds of things on occasion. If this is that particular suggestion, that's fine.
Do you recall your suggestions being rejected?
On occasion?
Is it a fact that they were cut out?
I don't know. It was not my responsibility to walk up to secretaries of state and defense and apprise them of things. It was my responsibility to carry out the lawful orders of my superiors. And as I have indicated for the last 3.5 days, I tried to do so, sir.
And did there come a time when Albert Hakim told you that he had negotiated a 9-point plan?
Again, I don't recall it being referred to specifically that way, but I've heard it since.
Did he communicate to you points, whether he called them 9 points or something else, that he had gotten agreement from the Iranians on?
I believe he may have.
Did you then seek approval from your superior on those 9 points?
If it was something that I judged ought to proceed, and it did proceed, I obviously sought that kind of approval.
If you would look at Exhibit 310, which is the translation that we have of the document that he provided to us and that he said he had cleared with you and that you had cleared with Admiral Poindexter. See if you recognize it.
Starts out with the Library of Congress.
They're the ones who did the translation for us.
Must be one over here somewhere. Well, obviously, if I had a copy of this, I would have gotten it from him in English, since I don't read Farsi,
well,
or Mr. Cave would have done the translation. But I'm not unfamiliar with this general proposal.
Well, do you know whether you shredded the one you got from him?
I may have.
And you're not unfamiliar with this? If you look at these points?
Those points look familiar, yes.
Did you communicate to him approval of these points?
Well, if we proceeded in this direction, and I would guess maybe we did, then I did seek approval, yes.
And did you include in the approval that you sought the item about his presenting a plan for the release of the
Dawa?
The Dawa?
Yes.
And at the time, and did you get that approval?
Yes.
And at the time that you got that approval, did the NSC have an official position against the United States asking for that?
That plan did not involve the United States asking for that. The plan that we presented to the Iranians, which we probably ought to take up in executive session if you want the details, did not involve the United States. And that's an important thing to understand. I knew well what our position was on the Dawa. I had written it with the concurrence of the Department of State. And of course, that was always one of the demands of the Hezbollah that hold the Americans hostage. Because 1 or 2 or maybe even 3 of the members of the Dawa are related to family members of the Hezbollah.
Colonel, I don't want to get into matters that ought to be on executive session, but I have this question to you.
Let us leave it at this, that it did not involve in any way the sacrifice of our position or the compromise of our position on the Dawa. It was a straightforward proposal to the Iranians as to how they could solve the problem.
Do you draw a distinction between Hakim and the United States government? Is that fair to say?
Absolutely.
Do you think that the Iranians who are dealing with him drew that distinction?
I don't know. asking me to put myself in the minds of the Iranians.
Well, you were there when he was being presented, when he was presented originally as the president's
As again,
interpreter.
I don't recall that I presented him that way at the second channel. I'm not too sure what role he was playing in that case, but I did present him that way in the first meetings. I did so in the presence of 2 CIA officers, one of them relatively senior. I did so with the concurrence of the Director of Central Intelligence and the National Security Advisor. And the reason for that is the Central Intelligence Agency could not or would not provide a translator for that session. I think we've gone over that.
What you're saying is that these were not decisions of Lieutenant Colonel North, they were decisions that were fully authorized.
That's correct.
I wasn't questioning the fact that you had authority from Mr. Poindexter or Casey, or that you had made tape recordings of it. We have the tape recordings.
I understand, counsel. I just didn't want anybody to be left with the misapprehension. After all of the paper that you now have gone nearly blind on, and I wore my fingers to the bone typing, or my secretary did, or typed myself on my profs, that I left anybody uninformed who needed to be informed in the conduct of these operations.
And you, when you talked about needed to be informed, your universe was the NSC, not the State Department.
My universe was the National Security Council, the President's personal staff.
And it was up to the President or the National Security Advisor to determine whether negotiations with Iran should involve the State Department or whether you should be the one left to handle them.
That's correct.
And they charged you with that.
I carried it out to the very best of my abilities, counsel.
Right. Now, you said, and I'm coming to the end now, you said on yesterday's session and before, when you were talking about the reasons why it was important not to disclose to Congress the support that was being given for the Contras by the NSC, that you and others were put in the position of balancing lives for lies. Remember that?
I remember that.
I'd like to just pursue that with you for a moment. Is it a fact that before the Boland period, the Congress had publicly appropriated money for the CIA to support the Contras?
Even under some of the Boland proscriptions, right. Yes.
And it is a fact that even during the Boland period, the President had publicly proclaimed his support for the Contras.
That is correct.
And it is a fact that the President had publicly said that he was going to seek more money from Congress when they cut it out.
My recollection, he said he would go back again and again and again, and he did so.
And it is a fact that Congress publicly appropriated the $27 million for humanitarian aid for the Contras.
And then gave us several waivers on the application of that.
And then Congress publicly authorized the exchange of intelligence information to assist the Contras, right?
Correct.
And Congress then, for fiscal 1987, publicly appropriated $100 million for the Contras for both lethal and non-lethal support.
Thank God.
And it's a fact that even during the Boland period, you wanted all of the Central American countries to know that notwithstanding Boland, that the United States was not abandoning the Contras and that the President would go back again and again to get money for them, right?
Correct.
And you also wanted to make sure that the Sandinistas knew that the Contras weren't through, right?
On one occasion, I told them myself.
And so, can you then just explain how you thought lives would have been endangered And when I say you, I'm talking not just about you, but Mr. McFarlane, if you know, who wrote the letters, and Admiral Poindexter, how you thought lives would be endangered when Congress said, are you giving support to the Contras by saying, we sure are, notwithstanding Boland?
Quite simply that the exposure of the operation would have caused it to be terminated.
And it would have caused it to be terminated by Congress.
By the very exposure of it, by the very fact that the Sandinistas would then know, for example, the origin of the supplies, the schedules of the flights, the place where things were landing, and put such enormous pressure
Colonel,
on the local governments that they were unable to support it.
Colonel, you've missed
I have not missed it at all. I am talking about the political debate that would have occurred here in this country and the revelations piece by piece by piece, just like we have on this activity.
So that it was the political debate and the possibility that if our covert policy became known, that it might be So it was the risk of political debate and the possibility that if it became known that we had continued support of the Contras, that it would be blocked, that caused this?
No, you're misunderstanding what I said. What I was saying was that the revelations of the actual details of this activity, some of which thankfully have still not been exposed, would have cost the lives of those with whom I was working, would have jeopardized the governments which had assisted us, would have jeopardized the lives of the Americans who in some cases were flying flights over Nicaragua, would have put at great risk those inside Nicaragua and in Eastern Europe and in Europe and other places where people were working hard to keep them alive. And some of those details have still not been exposed. And yet, because of things like these hearings, there will be governments who will be less willing to assist our country in the conduct of operations, even with findings and congressional approval and the rest of it. Colonel, and that's what I'm talking about, Counsel.
Colonel, you said that the disclosure of details could cause people to be less willing to support or could even cause risks. With the disclosure that we were supporting the Contras and that we were not abiding by the letter and spirit of Boland, have done that?
No, I don't believe so, Counsel. It was not an issue of whether or not we were abiding by the spirit and the letter of Boland. We did that. We lived within the constraints of Boland, which limited the use of appropriated funds. What we were concerned about, and we talked about some of this last night, the very fact that when there was a briefing held and lives were indeed placed at risk because people weren't quiet about it. And we talked about a couple of incidents last night, one of which I was very closely associated with. And the fact is, I have said consistently through my appearance here before these committees that there must be a better way. It is not easy for honorable men with whom I served or myself to sit in the White House or anywhere else in Washington and to have to weigh the differences between lives and lies. These were men who had high purposes. These are men with whom I worked on a daily basis who suffered great anxiety and internal discontent over what they were forced to do. The fact is, there must be a better way. And I have suggested one of those better ways. I suggested an earlier way, and that was to divulge nothing. I make no excuses for those letters or my presentation before Chairman Hamilton's committee assembled in the sit room. I have told you why I did it.
I'm not asking you that. Who forced them?
I think the relationship that exists between the executive and the Congress on these issues has given us the consequence of what happened in these events.